Keanu Reeves arrived in the neighborhood the way fog rolls in, quiet, unnoticed, and without announcement. There were no moving trucks lined with logos, no luxury SUVs blocking the street, no assistants shouting directions into phones. Just an older pickup pulling into a clean but modest driveway, followed by a black motorcycle that hummed once and went silent. He unloaded his own boxes, nodding politely to anyone who happened to glance his way, never lingering long enough to invite conversation. In a gated community where arrivals were usually events and exits were performances, his presence felt almost confusing. Some neighbors barely registered him at all, while others noticed something more unsettling: he wasn't trying to be seen. The HOA noticed immediately. They always did. During their weekly meeting, his name appeared on the screen under *, New Resident Review. *, there were questions, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with thin smiles. *, no visible staff, no known profession, minimal vehicle registration. One board member leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. Probably renting, he said, as if that alone explained everything. Another added, people with nothing to hide usually have something to show. The room filled with knowing chuckles. None of them had spoken to Keanu. None of them had asked. But conclusions came easily in a place where appearance mattered more than behavior. Over the next few days, the comments followed him like a shadow. He walked his trash bin to the curb at sunrise and heard murmurs behind curtains. He watered his small front garden in the evening and caught the slow stare of a neighbor pretending to check their phone. Someone joked loudly at the mailbox cluster about ghost residents who lived like they were temporary. Keanu heard it all. He always smiled, always nodded, always kept moving. Silence, for him, wasn't weakness, it was a choice. But to the HOA, silence looked like defiance. The first letter arrived in a crisp white envelope, stamped with authority. Failure to engage in community culture. Keanu read it once, then folded it carefully and set it aside. The second letter came 3 days later, citing his front yard as uninspired and lacking visible personalization. A fine was included, small, almost petty. He paid it without hesitation. That, more than anything, irritated the board. They expected pushback, arguments, excuses. Instead, they got compliance wrapped in quiet dignity. It made them uneasy, like a rule being followed too calmly. At the next HOA inspection walk, Keanu crossed paths with 2 board members holding clipboards. One of them smiled thinly and said, "You know, participation goes a long way here." Keanu met his eyes, respectful and steady. "I try to be a good neighbor," he replied. The man scoffed after he walked away. "Good neighbors don't hide," he muttered. Laughter followed. Keanu didn't turn around. He carried his groceries inside and closed the door softly, unaware, or perhaps very aware, that his refusal to perform had already marked him as a problem. What none of them understood was this: Keanu wasn't quiet because he lacked confidence. He was quiet because life had taught him how loud ego could be. He didn't decorate his porch to impress strangers or attend meetings to feel powerful. He believed in something simpler: do no harm, offer help when needed, and let actions speak long after words fade. The HOA saw emptiness where there was depth, and in their rush to fill the silence with judgment, they unknowingly began a conflict that would expose far more about themselves than it ever would about him. The HOA didn't wait long after the first fines were paid. Compliance, instead of satisfying them, seemed to awaken something sharper, an urge to test how far quiet obedience could be pushed. Inspections became frequent and oddly specific. Clipboards appeared outside Keanu's home without warning, measuring tape stretched across his lawn, photos taken of his porch at different times of day. One report noted the absence of seasonal decor, another criticized the lack of outward social engagement. These weren't rules written anywhere, but the HOA enforced them as if they were law. Keanu watched from his window once, expression unreadable, as 2 board members debated whether a potted plant counted as visible effort. The first public confrontation happened during a monthly community meeting. Residents sat in neat rows, whispering, scrolling phones, waiting for their turn to complain about parking or noise. Keanu arrived quietly and took a seat in the back, hands folded, eyes calm. When his name was called, a board member cleared her throat and read aloud from a prepared statement, citing his continued pattern of isolation and failure to embody community values. The words sounded rehearsed, polished for humiliation. A few people chuckled. Someone muttered, "Figures." Keanu stood, his voice steady but soft. "I follow the rules. I respect my neighbors. I keep to myself." The HOA president smiled thinly and replied, "Respect requires visibility." The room laughed again, louder this time. After that meeting, the tone shifted from passive to personal. Notices were no longer private. They were posted on the community board, phrased vaguely enough to invite speculation. Asterisk, certain residents continue to resist community integration. Asterisk, everyone knew who it meant. Children whispered. Adults glanced and looked away. The HOA began documenting his daily habits. When he left, when he returned, who visited, which was almost no one. One board member joked openly at the pool, "If he's not hiding something, why does he live like a ghost?" Keanu heard it while passing by, a towel over his shoulder. He paused for half a second, then kept walking. The boldest move came in the form of a letter hand-delivered to his door, stamped urgent. It questioned whether he met the financial stability expectations of the neighborhood. The implication was clear. Maybe he didn't belong. Maybe he was temporary. Maybe he was a risk. It wasn't just a fine this time, it was an accusation. Keanu read the letter slowly, once, then again. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time afterward, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time, the conflict felt less like annoyance and more like intent. Not everyone agreed with the HOA's behavior. A retired couple across the street remembered Keanu helping them lift a fallen fence panel without being asked. A single mother recalled him returning her lost dog late at night, refusing any reward. But fear kept people quiet. No one wanted to become the next target. The HOA thrived on that silence, mistaking it for approval. They scheduled another meeting, this one labeled Mandatory Review. The subtext was obvious: show up or be judged in absence. When Keanu arrived at that meeting, the room felt colder. The board sat higher than before, papers stacked like weapons. The president leaned forward and said, "We need transparency." Keanu met his gaze. "I live here. I pay my dues. I follow the rules." The president nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind us taking a closer look." It wasn't a question. It was a warning. And as Keanu returned to his seat, the HOA had no idea that the deeper they dug, the faster the ground beneath them was about to collapse. The task was framed as routine. The HOA president assigned it casually, sliding a thin folder across the table to the youngest clerk in the room. "Just a background verification," he said, barely looking up. "We need to know who we're dealing with." The clerk nodded, though something about the wording unsettled her. It wasn't about rule enforcement anymore. It felt personal. Later that evening, alone in the HOA office, she typed Keanu's name into the system without expectation. At first, the results looked ordinary. Property records, tax confirmations, clean compliance history. Then the search expanded. Additional properties appeared. Then more, and more. She frowned, adjusted the filters, and tried again. What came next didn't make sense. Corporate entities linked subtly but unmistakably to the same name. Film production credits stretching back decades. Awards. Interviews. Net worth figures that made her blink twice, then sit back in her chair. She opened a browser tab, then another. The face on the screen matched the man she'd seen carrying groceries alone, nodding politely, never raising his voice. Keanu Reeves. The realization hit her like a dropped glass. Sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. She felt a strange mix of embarrassment and dread, not because he was famous, but because of how easily the board had dismissed him. She kept digging, compelled now by something deeper than assignment. Charitable foundations appeared next, most with no public branding, no headlines. Donations to children's hospitals, quiet funding for cancer research, support for disaster relief efforts routed through intermediaries that avoided attention. Notes from interviews surfaced where he spoke about grief, humility, and the value of living simply. This wasn't a man hiding from scrutiny. This was a man who had deliberately stepped away from it. The clerk printed the pages, her hands unsteady, each sheet a silent accusation against the assumptions made in that boardroom. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was different before a single word was spoken. The clerk placed the folder on the table without comment. One by one, the board members flipped through the pages. Smiles faded. Someone coughed. Another leaned back, suddenly unsure. The president's confident posture stiffened as he reached the final page. "This can't be right," he muttered. No one laughed this time. The room, once full of authority and arrogance, now felt small, crowded with regret. Outside the meeting room, word began to spread faster than anyone could contain it. A resident recognized the name. Another pulled out a phone. Faces changed as reality settled in. The quiet guy wasn't quiet because he lacked importance. He was quiet because he had nothing left to prove. Shame moved through the community like a slow tide. Some remembered their jokes. Others remembered looking away. Keanu, meanwhile, spent the evening exactly as he always did, watering his plants, feeding a stray cat, unaware that the narrative around him had shifted irreversibly. By the end of the meeting, the HOA had lost control of the story. They spoke in cautious tones now, suggesting misunderstandings and overreach. Fines were quietly marked for review. Language softened, but the damage had already been done, not to Keanu, but to them. In trying to expose him, they had exposed themselves. And as the clerk gathered her papers and switched off the lights, one truth echoed louder than any accusation the HOA had ever made. The most dangerous people are not the loud ones, but the ones who never need to raise their voice. The HOA's transformation was immediate and painfully obvious. Where once there had been clipped tones and smug authority, there was now hesitation. Emails were sent late at night, rewritten twice before being delivered. Phrases like, "upon further review," and, "in the spirit of community," replaced accusations. The fines that had once been enforced with pride were suddenly described as administrative errors. Board members who had avoided Keanu's eye now greeted him too warmly, their smiles stretching beyond comfort. The power they once wielded so confidently now felt unstable, like a floor that had begun to crack beneath their feet. They invited him to a private meeting first. Coffee was offered. Chairs were adjusted. The HOA president cleared his throat and spoke in a tone that aimed for friendly but landed somewhere near desperate. "We may have misjudged you," he said, choosing each word carefully. "We'd like to put everything behind us." Keanu listened, hands folded, expression calm. When they offered to waive all past fines and suggested he join the board, "Your presence would really elevate the community," he declined with a gentle shake of his head. "I don't need a position," he said. "I just want peace." The simplicity of the response left the room quiet. Word of the reversal spread quickly, and with it came guilt. Neighbors who had stayed silent began to replay moments in their minds, jokes they laughed at, comments they didn't challenge, assumptions they accepted. A few approached Keanu with awkward apologies. He accepted them all without judgment, never once mentioning what had been said about him. That, somehow, made the apologies feel heavier. The HOA scheduled an open community meeting, hoping transparency might repair the damage. Attendance was higher than ever. People came not to complain, but to witness. The room fell silent when Keanu stood to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't list offenses or demand accountability. "I didn't move here to be important," he said calmly. "I moved here because I value quiet and I value kindness. I followed the rules because I believe rules should protect people, not target them." He paused, letting the words settle. "If being quiet made me suspicious, then maybe we should ask why silence feels threatening." Applause rose, not polite, but genuine, the kind that comes from recognition rather than excitement. Several board members avoided eye contact as the clapping continued. One resigned that night, citing personal reasons. Another followed days later. The HOA president remained, but diminished. His authority no longer felt absolute. It had been reframed, exposed as something borrowed rather than earned. Keanu returned to his seat without ceremony, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room knew better. Power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through restraint. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Conversations replaced whispers. Neighbors waved more often. The HOA became quieter, not because it was silenced, but because it had been humbled. Keanu returned to his routines, unchanged. Morning walks, evening watering, occasional nods. The difference now was in how people looked at him, not with curiosity or suspicion, but with respect. He never asked for it. He never needed it. And in that truth, the community finally understood who had been leading all along. The story didn't end with the HOA stepping back. In many ways, that was only the beginning. A week after the open meeting, a small article appeared in the local paper. Not a celebrity headline, but a human one. It spoke of a quiet resident who had been unfairly targeted, of a neighborhood forced to confront its own assumptions. The article never mentioned wealth or awards. It focused on actions. Anonymous tips followed, each revealing a fragment of truth the community had overlooked. Donations to the local children's hospital traced back to a foundation no one had recognized. School supplies delivered every fall, paid for quietly. Medical bills covered without explanation. Slowly, the picture became clearer, not of a star, but of a man who had been practicing kindness long before anyone was watching. Neighbors began to connect moments they had dismissed at the time. The elderly man whose car broke down late one night remembered a stranger stopping to help, refusing to leave until the engine turned over. A single mother recalled groceries appearing on her porch after a rough week, no note attached. The stray cats that lingered near Keanu's yard weren't a nuisance. They were fed, checked by a vet, and protected from the cold. None of it had been documented. None of it had been shared. The silence that once seemed suspicious now revealed itself as discipline, a deliberate refusal to turn compassion into currency. The HOA, now cautious and subdued, attempted one final gesture. A plaque was proposed. A community acknowledgement. Something permanent, something visible. Keanu declined again, politely. If you turn kindness into recognition, he said, people start doing it for the wrong reason. The board had no response to that. They removed the proposal quietly, the same way they now handled everything else. Control had been replaced with consideration, and no one wanted to test that balance again. Life returned to normal. But normal looked different now. People spoke more gently. Meetings were shorter. Rules were enforced with context instead of ego. And Keanu, he remained exactly the same. Morning walks, quiet evenings, no speeches, no statements. He waved when greeted, smiled when spoken to, and kept his door open only to those who genuinely needed help. Fame never entered the conversation because it no longer mattered. The community had learned the cost of judging someone by volume instead of values. Months later, a new family moved in. They noticed the calm first, the absence of tension that usually clung to gated neighborhoods. Someone mentioned Keanu casually, without titles or reverence. Just, he's a good man, keeps to himself. And that was enough. No warnings, no gossip, no assumptions. The lesson had settled deep, passed quietly from one resident to another like a shared understanding. In the end, the HOA never truly lost power. It lost the illusion that power came from authority alone. Keanu never fought them, never exposed them publicly, never demanded justice. He simply remained who he was until the truth became impossible to ignore. And that was the final lesson the neighborhood carried forward. The strongest people don't announce themselves, don't defend their worth, and don't need permission to live with integrity. They walk quietly, leave no footprints, and somehow change everything anyway.